Thank you, and I'd like to welcome all of you to today's panel at 2, which is We Read in Order to Come to Life, Grief, Joy, and the Magic of Literary Form. I'm really pleased to be here with our 3 authors, Victoria Chang, Pik-Shuen Fung, and Claire-Louise Bennett. My name is Sylvia Brownrigg. I'm a writer and novelist. My most recent book was Invisible Countries. We've already been asked to silence your devices. And I'd like to start by thanking the sponsors of this panel, the Consulate General of Canada, San Francisco Silicon Valley, and Culture Ireland. So please join me in thanking them for their support of this event. Also, I'd like to point you to the fact that the 3 authors will be signing their books at 3:15 at the Sausalito Books by the Bay tent in the park. So I'm going to introduce our writers first, and then I've asked them each to do a very short reading just so you have a sense of their really remarkable and distinct voices. I could spend probably a third of our panel introducing these writers. There's so much to say about them, but you'll enjoy more listening to them speak about their work. Claire-Louise Bennett is her debut collection of stories, Pond, was shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize. And Gia Tolentino's review in The New Yorker was titled, "A Work of Fiction That Will Make You Pleasantly Insane." In it, Tolentino likened Bennett's work to that of Lydia Davis and of Samuel Beckett, among others, both pretty wonderful analogies. Bennett is English and now lives in Ireland, and she'll be discussing her new work, Checkout 19, which has garnered praise from, among others, Karl Ove Knausgaard and Roddy Doyle, who wrote, "I fell into Checkout 19 and didn't want to climb back out," which was quite similar to my own reading experience. Victoria Chang's last book of poetry, Obit, won the LA Times Book Prize for Poetry in 2021, as well as the PEN Volcker Award, and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her new book, The Trees Witness Everything, published by Copper Canyon Press, is her 6th book of poetry. She's also the author of children's books and a powerful collage-like work of creative nonfiction in words and images called Dear Memory. A critic in the Los Angeles Review of Books noted of one of Chang's techniques that she is mesmerized by the magic of repetition. Magic as in not only the otherworldly, but also the spells that language can ignite. And I think we will be speaking quite a bit today about the magic of language in these 3 very distinct books. Pik-Shuen Fung's debut novel, Ghost Forest, was described by Madeline Teen as risky, precise, witty, and beautiful. And Publishers Weekly pointed to the way the book brings bracing fragments and poignant vignettes together into a stunning and evocative whole. Born in Hong Kong and raised in Vancouver, Pik-Shuen tells the story in this book of what it is to have a family fractured by immigration. In her story, the father stays in Hong Kong to work, becoming an astronaut father, a phrase I hope she'll explain, while the mother goes to Vancouver with her infant daughter and is eventually joined by their grandparents. Ghost Forest becomes a story of living between 2 cultures, as well as the many flights taken to maintain the connections within a family, even into the period when the father becomes very ill and the mother and 2 daughters return frequently to Hong Kong to attend to his care. So in introducing the 3 to start these brief readings, I think one of our first discussion points will be about form. And so I think that was all the more reason to enable you to hear the very distinct voices. We have 1 poet and 2 novelists here, but I think that you'll find that their work defies some of those strict genre lines. So maybe we'll start with Victoria and go down the line with the reading.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for moderating, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you too as well. And I look forward to listening to your readings and also the conversation. I'm just going to read. We have just a few minutes, so I'll just read maybe one poem from this book, Obit, and then I'll read a couple tiny poems from this new book that just came out. And there's really nothing you need to know about Obit except that my mother passed away in 2015 of pulmonary fibrosis, and that's when your lungs harden and you suffocate to death. So it was a very long and painful illness. And then my dad had a stroke about 15 years ago, and he recently passed away in January. So he's always a ghost throughout this book. And so I'll just read one poem from here. And the poems are shaped like little obituaries. Everything dies, essentially. Grief. As I knew it died many times. It died trying to reunite with other lesser deaths. Each morning, I lay out my children's clothing to cover their grief. The grief remains, but is changed by what it is covered with. A picture of oblivion is not the same as oblivion. My grief is not the same as my pain. My mother was a mathematician, so I tried to calculate my grief. My father was an engineer, so I tried to build a box around my grief, along with a small wooden bed that grief could lie down on. The text kept interrupting my grief, forcing me to speak about nothing. If you cut out a rectangle of a perfectly blue sky, no clouds, no wind, no birds, frame it with a blue frame, place it face up on the floor of an empty museum with an open atrium to the sky, that is grief. And then I'll just read a couple tiny poems, and they are from this new book that is kind of an extension of Obit, because there are a bunch of short tankas in this book that are like 57577 syllabic forms. And a friend of mine said, you should just for fun write a whole bunch of short poems. And I thought that would be fun. So I did a little research and found all these other forms that were beyond the haiku and the tanka. I mean, there's some cool ones like the katauda, which is 577, the sudoka, which is 577, 577. Anyway, they're like tiny. And then I gave myself one more constraint, which is to use W.S. Merwin's poem titles. And the reason why is that the poem titles are super cool and open. And so it was really hard though, because syllabics are hard. And so I had to rewrite them. And sometimes they don't work that well in certain lines, but it was just a fun process. So I'll just read a few of these. This one's called Far Along in the Story. Once I sat in rain, opened my mouth to the sky. I yearned to be changed, but each drop was a small knife. At first I fainted, but when I woke up, all the ticking had gone and all the centuries were won. My choices no longer hurt. Losing a language. We were born with a large door on our backs. When will we know if it opens? And then maybe I'll read two more. Let's see. There's so many in here. Someone actually counted. So I'll just read two. I'll just pick one. Snowfall. We say the snow falls, but it really seizes. Because it is light, it takes 7 years to grab. By the time it does, the old wars are over, and my mother is dead. But it lands on the new wars, melts on a different mother. And this one is really short. It's called To the Book. Here is March again. An image is a shawl. Birds are a transcript of our thoughts. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'll read from the first few pages of my novel, Ghost Forest. Bird. 21 days after my dad died, a bird perched on the railing of my balcony. It was brown. It stayed there for a long time. Hi, Dad, I said. Thanks for checking up on me. I lay down on the couch and read some emails on my phone. When I looked up again, the bird was gone. Guai, In my family, the best thing a child could be was guai. It meant you were good. It meant you did as you were told. When I was 4, or maybe 6, I found out I was supposed to have a baby brother. But my mom said the baby flew to the sky, and that was why my dad was sad those days. But why is he sad, I asked. Because he's a traditional Chinese father and he wants to have a son. Try to cheer him up. Okay, I said. I decided I would be so guai, I would be more perfect than a son. Astronaut Family. I was 3.5 when we immigrated to Canada. Like many other families, we left Hong Kong before the 1997 handover. They say almost 1/6 of the city left during this time. My dad had seen news stories of Hong Kongers who couldn't find jobs in their new countries. Stories of managers who became dishwashers because they couldn't speak the new language. Like many other fathers, my dad decided he didn't want to leave his job in manufacturing behind. To help my mom, my grandma and grandpa agreed to move with us to Canada. That spring, my dad took 2 weeks off from work, and the 5 of us headed to Kai Tak Airport. All my aunts and uncles came to the departure gates to see us off. In Canada, there were more Hong Kong immigrants than in any other country. And in Vancouver, I had many classmates whose fathers stayed in Hong Kong for work too. I didn't think of my family as different. I thought, this is what Hong Kong fathers do. Astronaut Family. It's a term invented by the Hong Kong mass media. A family with an astronaut father, flying here, flying there.
If it's missing.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello. We sat on the floor in the middle of our room with a bottle of wine, and all our things were in their places, all around us, exactly where they always were. The dressing gown on the hook. We wanted more than anything for our things to stay where they were. Yes, we did. We wanted to stay where we were. That's right. We didn't want to leave, did we? No, of course we didn't. We wanted to take our dressing gown off the hook we'd banged into the side of the dresser and go down the hall and have a long, hot bath in the bathroom beside Bettina's room. We were just getting the hang of living in London. That's right. Now that we weren't a student anymore, now that that part of our being in London had ended, we felt much better about being there. Yes, now that that monumental disappointment was done and dusted, we felt quite optimistic. We did. We did. We felt light as a bird and fairly upbeat, in fact. But we didn't have any money. No, we didn't. We owed money. We did, actually. So what we found and wanted was neither here nor there. We had to get real. That's right. We had to face up to reality. Get real. Get real. We didn't want to. No. No. No, we didn't.
Thank you very much. Pik-Shuen, I wanted to start with you in terms of the question of form. I'm curious because your novel has these short sort of chapterlets, which each are titled in a way that feels not dissimilar to the world that Victoria's building in her book. But I'm curious how you arrived at that structure, and if you were trying to tell the story in another way, and then that led you into this particular book, or if you could talk a little bit about that choice.
Yeah, I was actually in school for visual art, and the summer after my dad passed away, I was trying to work on these video projects, and I ended up writing out these voiceovers to put with these video art, and it came out in this vignette form. And as I wrote more and more, I realized I just really enjoyed the process.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't even want to play with the visuals anymore, and I decided to turn it into a book. So it was really intuitively driven, and I felt like the title kind of served as like a picture frame, and I just built it in that way. I mean, at one point, because I wasn't trained as a writer, I tried to write it in more traditional novel form, and I realized I was so bad at that. So yeah, I reverted it back to this short vignette.
And some of the vignettes appear to be in the form of almost as if in the form of interviews you've done, or at least in the words of perhaps your relatives or the relatives of the narrator. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's definitely inspired by conversations I had with my mother and grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
So interwoven with these vignettes are these kind of fictionalized oral histories with the women in the family.
Mm-hmm. And Claire-Louise, the formal experiments of your work are partly in the voice and the person telling the story. The part that you read, that the prose goes in and out of that kind of collective we. And initially, just beginning the book, you think that perhaps it's a narration of a family. But I'm just interested in how you found that form, and whether it was a discovery in the writing, or did you sort of make a decision that you were writing a novel and make some of those decisions at the outset? In other words, did the form arise in the course of the writing?
With the what do you call it? First person plural. I kind of worked with on some pieces for quite some time. I don't know why. I quite liked it. I liked the back and forth that it allows, but at the same time, I didn't want them to be in conflict with each other. Mm-hmm. Didn't find that particularly interesting. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was something I had there for quite a while, actually. And in terms of thinking about form generally, and point of view, and all those sorts of apparatus, I suppose, that are quite unconventional in this book, and thinking about why that would be so. I think some of it has to do. This book deals quite a lot with class. I'm a working class English person who went to Ireland when I was quite young. And my class then wasn't detectable in Ireland. Ireland isn't a classless place, but as an outsider, I can't really be identified because they don't really know what kind of accent I have. And my position at the moment, in the way I'm understanding how I use language, has been very much illuminated, I suppose, by looking at the work of writers such as the French writer Arno.
You quote her a few times through the book.
Yeah, I'm not sure how familiar you might be with her. She's about 80 now. She was born in 1940 in a working class place in Normandy, and her parents were épicerie owners, cafe épicerie. And she talks a lot about the relationship a person has, a working class person has, to language, and how it's not something that you just sort of take for granted and you can kind of just get on and work with. It's not a neutral device. You realize that sometimes it's it's not always serving you that well, and it's not necessarily reflecting your reality. So when I'm sort of, and not that you've done this, but it happens that I'm asked about being an experimental writer and so on, like it's a purely stylistic decision. And it's not, it's a deliberate sort of interrogation of language, because on the one hand, I love it. And on the other hand, I'm suspicious of it. So there's more I could say about that, but that would do for starters.
We could probably speak about language and interrogations of language, because obviously that's a very live issue in all of these 3 books. I mean, I suppose as a poet, you probably have that question more than prose writers. I'm interested, well, anything that jumps to mind to say about that, but also specifically was in terms of the form for this book that you were just describing briefly. Perhaps you could describe the tankas a little bit more fully, what they are, because that's the main form of the trees witness everything. There is this interesting section in the middle of the book that's more prose-like, and so I'm interested. I'm interested in how you made those decisions.
Yeah, I mean, for me, form is always a way to feel more free, and it's somewhat paradoxical. And I say this to like my students all the time too. It's like I'm asking you to write a sonnet, not to constrict you, but actually to free yourself from your own mind. And I always quote Terence Hayes, who said, form for him is like a bird flying freely within a cage. And I find that to be really beautiful. And I think for me, the bird actually leaves the cage, and does eventually possibly come back, maybe not as a bird. And so I think for me, that form is freedom. And when I was writing the little poems in here, I'd come off of writing these very subject heavy laden poems all about grief and death and those sorts of topics. And I was really interested in freeing the mind from itself and freeing the mind from subject matter. And one way that I was trying to do that was basically through syllabics, because, if you have like 5 syllables, I see an outline, that's 5. But let's say you came up with a different, I want to see an outline. Well, that doesn't fit. And then you start thinking, well, what else could you put in there? And then you have the title, which is first sight, which you took from someone else. Suddenly it's like all these different ideas are coming into your mind that are not ones you would have had. And so, that was really exciting to me in terms of writing, because I feel like, so much of the time when we're writing, I think we can have our ideas sort of ahead of the language. And so I was very interested in having the language ahead of any sort of preconceived notions or ideas. And so that's sort of how these poems came about. And you would ask about the middle section. I think they're just these rectangular shaped long poem. When I was in residence at Marfa, in Marfa for the Landon Foundation residency, which is such a privilege. I mean, I never thought I'd be able to get to do stuff like that, because I had, really young children, and then I was really busy. But I got to go, and, I didn't really have anything to write. And so, I ended up not writing, which was really disappointing. But then my friend started writing me poem letters and forcing me to write back, instead of taking walks and doing all the things that one does. And so I wrote letter poems back, and then that became a central part in the book that are shaped like little rectangles, because I was also looking at a lot of artwork. So Donald Judd is really big out there. Lots of, very hard angles and things like that. So that's how that middle section came about.
It's interesting because even in these remarks, you're all, especially the 2 of you, have been referring to other writers. And that was going to be another one of my questions. Claire-Louise, in your book, there's such a lot about reading, and the characters very, the reading is one way I feel that character is sort of developing her sense of the world. And the book is very full of names and book titles. And and you mentioned Annie Arno, and I was sort of curious how that worked for you, referring to others' work as you build that character in that story. And then I'm curious to come back to the Merwin also for you. But can you talk about the role reading has for your character and the world that she builds with all these authors around her?
Well, I think it occurred to me as I was writing that the funny thing with a lot of books is that they sort of, it's not that they deny the existence of other books, but they don't really say, very much that would make you aware that there are other books in the world as you're reading it, if you know what I mean.
Right.
And I thought that was kind of a bit funny because I read an awful lot, and in a sense it felt almost a bit sort of dishonest because it's like, well, I didn't just get this from the wind. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I've read an awful lot of books, and I felt like I should let them in, really, in a way. And that was something I'd always sort of been interested in. And they've had such an enormous impact. And again, it was looking at it from, I suppose, a kind of a class position of really the power then that they do have when you very sort of gradually kind of just discover them as a younger person. I mean, I read a lot of crap when I was quite young for a while. I didn't really know that, I read like Sidney Sheldon and stuff like
Well,
that.
there's a great mixture of literary characters in the story, including
Sidney Sheldon's really good, actually.
The
There's nothing to get. But and Danielle Steele, I read a lot of Danielle Steele. But then I got a sense of there being, like literature.
The grandmother has these, I don't know what kind of books they are, but they're sort of lurid murder stories that definitely cast a sort of the tone of
about
the room.
Victorian like murders, and they had photographs in them, black and white photographs in them. They were really quite scary. So they're very, they're very powerful. And if you don't maybe have so many books in your home, because there's this thing now called shelfies. When people take photographs of themselves with like books, but and you can order, you can ask someone to like acquire books for you, and they're kind of nicely sort of arranged. And so that's a thing as a signifier. There's always been that aspect to them, and they've always been a kind of a part of middle class life in England. One grows up with shelves of books, usually either side of a fireplace.
You can buy them in the US as sort of decoration, interior decor elements.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Pik-Shuen, it's interesting that you talk about your background in visual art, because there are fewer the artists who you refer to in around the middle of the story. The character is studying art in China. Has gone abroad to study, and there's maybe you could describe the woman artist that she discovers, who's from the 13th century, and just how her discovery shapes your character's sensibility.
Yeah. So, the protagonist of this book is a visual artist, and she goes to the China Academy of Art to study Chinese ink painting. And the classes are all about imitating these master artists, and they're all men. And she starts doing some research, and she learns about this female painter from the 1300s called Guan Daosheng, and she was known as the most well-respected Chinese woman painter in history, but none of her works were archived. And she was married to this other famous calligrapher, and his works are collected around the world. So it was specifically because she's a woman that her works, there's like one authenticated painting that's left.
Astonishing. How did you choose Merwin's titles, or what was it about those titles that appealed to you?
Yeah, I mean, when you're all talking and when Claire-Louise was talking as well, I was thinking about how, and what an interesting thought that you had about how writers don't really write about other books and things. And my initial thought was, wow, that's really fascinating. I never thought about that before. But then I thought, well, poets actually do write about other writers all the time. And like, I think about Maggie Nelson in Bluets, in The Argonauts. And I think about, I mean, like we're always referencing philosophy and art. And I also think that I like to do that too. Cause I was thinking how I think of my writing style or just process as correspondence. So I'm corresponding with, everyone before me or, whether it's visual art, like I just finished a manuscript of poems corresponding with the visual artist Agnes Martin. For me, I need something to press against. Otherwise, staring at a blank page is so overwhelming. And so, so for the Merwin titles, it's just, I mean, it's also serendipitous. I happen to be currently, publishing with Copper Canyon Press, and they send lots of Merwin to me. They've sent lots of Merwin to me over the years, collected, selected of collecteds. I mean, how many ways can you cut these books? Essential is another one that, I've read all of Merwin, and I'm not sure I would have read Merwin as closely before if I hadn't been with Copper Canyon. So I think there's just sort of this weird fate, that happens as artists and writers and people, right? I mean, the random people we run into and what we're doing, what are we doing here today? And it's very strange when you actually think about it. And so that's to me how I came about these. I mean, there's such great titles like The Thread, Rainlight, Gift, No One, The Removal. I mean, that's just asking me to correspond with them. They're so open. And I just love that. Witness. I mean, that's just, what could that be? That could be a million things. And so that was kind of fun. And the great thing about prompts essentially is what I did for myself is you can lose them. So if I didn't want to have those titles there anymore, I could just eliminate the prompt. So there's no, the prompt becomes a ghost. And there's always all sorts of fun things you can do, I think, related to correspondences, if I think about it that way.
I love that idea of correspondence. That seems very rich, the sort of the conversation going on. I don't know if it's related to that point or not, but I was quite struck by the fact, this is, again, a little bit more conventional in poetry, but none of the narrators of these three books is named. And it's more unusual, obviously, with prose works. And so I don't know if it's related to the fact that the stories may have some autobiographical elements, but that you didn't, they didn't want to tie down the characters with the specifics. Once you name a character, that's very much a box around that person, I feel, in a way. Or was that, again, was it a deliberate choice, or it sort of came out of the way the story was being told for both of you? I don't know. Pik-Shuen, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, I think there's a few different reasons, but one of them is that none of the characters are really named.
Yeah.
And I think because in Chinese families, we don't really address people with their first names, but it's more like relational.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I wanted to capture here. But also because it was really important for me to incorporate a lot of space in this book, and I wanted it to feel spacious, and I felt like having an unnamed narrator, it creates this kind of distance, but also like a sense of intimacy at the same time.
They're very vivid people without having some of those more conventional tags that are sort of prose characters often do have.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
But it does create a space, and sometimes those kinds of details that are conventionally used to establish a character but then sometimes be a bit of a barrier in a strange way as well.
What's interesting in your book is that other people are named. So, and then in fact, some of their names change. So it kind of, they have more specifics in that way of, of what a name creates than the person whose self we're kind of surrounded by with her voice. The teachers, for example.
Oh yeah, and then there's a character who completely changes. Actually, there's a character in it called just the Doctor, and he crops up in as I'm recalling a story that I wrote many years ago, and then for reasons I won't go into now, I didn't continue with. But anyway, I'm recalling it, and I remember there was this character called the Doctor, and he undergoes quite a kind of a transformation, because in the original there wasn't really much to him, and he's sort of just described as a bit vampiric and incredibly pale, maybe about 300 years old or something. So I had a kind of a vague sort of ghostly phantom sense of him. But then in the retelling, right, the story gets bigger and more substantial, and then actually he becomes more substantial, and there's more things going on, and there's more scenes, and so the whole thing gets a bit more meat on its bones, and he gets more meat on his bones. And actually, he ends up being actually quite dishy. And it was just a bit weird. And I guess that's what happens, right? I mean, I don't really write character very often. So it was a real experience for me. It was a really new and exciting experience for me. And I was like, oh, this is what people mean when they say a character comes to life, because I really felt that happening. But then instead of going back to the start of when I introduced that character and changing it so there was a kind of a continuity, I just thought, well, I'm going to leave it because it's kind of funny, and I'm showing the reader really what happens, like, the process that actually occurs. So yeah, even though he starts off being pale and floaty and 300 years old, and he ends up being really suave and a bit like that guy out of the film The Great Beauty, that Italian guy who I do quite fancy. That's bad writing to a degree, because it's like, well, how did he get from there to there? And it's like, well, he just did, because that's what happens in your head. And I kind of wanted to show that because it's funny.
I haven't done very well at keeping us on the first part of the title of our panel, Grief and Joy. What was striking to me is that two of these books there is a death of a parent sort of hovering over the story, and yet in a lot of ways, I mean, Pik-Shuen, your story has more of the family going through this illness and demise of their father, but so much of the grief that is canvassed in these two very different books is really a lot about noticing and other elements of the world coming to life. And so I don't feel, I don't know, it's given that you've written about grief and loss in some of these earlier books, did you feel that The Trees Witness Everything was a different kind of approach to that? Or approach is the wrong word, but different expression of that feeling?
I recently gave a talk at Breadloaf, the Writers' Conference, about joy poetry, because I was curious about it. And when I don't understand something, then I want to kind of dig in. And I kind of discovered a lot of even poems that I would categorize as joyful poems have a dark thread in them, and Zadie Smith has written this great essay on joy. And you can Google it. It's still out and easy to find. And so much of my thinking has sort of changed. I used to think that grief and maybe joy, or grief and happiness, those things were individual, mutually exclusive emotions. And after reading all these joy, quote unquote, joy poems throughout the ages, I've noticed, in my opinion, is that the two are intertwined, and they're maybe two sides of the same coin kind of thing. One actually, in my mind, can't really exist without the other. And so, yeah, I think for me, The Trees Witness Everything was maybe a little bit more of a hopeful exploration. Also, I mean, a lot of the poems in here were commissioned. And so one of the things in the back is called Love Letters, and they're these tiny 3-line poems, and they were commissioned by the Los Angeles County Public Library and the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health's We Rise initiative. And the whole project was to write little notes of joy, specifically on hope, heartbreak, resilience, and love. And I thought it was really interesting how they combined those 4 words together. But the little poems that I wrote and other people wrote and the public wrote that we selected were running across libraries in Los Angeles County. And so they are a little bit, way more hopeful than I normally would be. The last poem is, "Let me tell you a story about hope. It always starts and ends with birds." Normally I wouldn't write that and I wouldn't think that, but I think that if you're commissioned to write something hopeful, then that's sort of what I did. But then it did actually really get me intellectually thinking about what is hope, what is joy, in this time of pandemic. And all these poems were written during the pandemic. And so I thought, I just came out of it thinking it's all here. Like, we think we're supposed to find happiness or search for happiness. It's here, it's already here, in the middle and in the midst of a lot of grief and sadness. So, I'll stop.
I mean, I think of how you said that so beautifully, and the way that the two are intertwined. And I felt that in your story as well, that although the moment when the father, after this long illness and much care being given by his family and doctors, and moved from one hospital to another and back again to his home city, that the actual moment of the father's death is not as sad in a certain way, because it's really very full of life. It's full of the life of the family after his death, and the stories they're still telling, and the rituals, very much the rituals that the character goes through. And so I just thought that was very beautifully captured in the way you tell that. That's right. There's not really a question there.
Thank you. I think, I started writing this book focusing on the grief, but then over time I thought more about the joy and about the love and these special moments that this family had. So the narrator, it's after her father dies that she starts asking her mother and grandmother about their lives, and that's where all the humor comes in. And so I think for me, because I think grief is so personal, I really wanted to write this book in a way that felt really multifaceted, but also very spacious, so that readers could bring their own experiences and feel their own emotions. And so that's part of why there was a lot of empty space throughout.
I was going to say there even is empty space on the page. There are pages that are very sort of airy with just a few when the father is trying to communicate from his hospital. But I feel that we should soon go over to questions and answers. I can only imagine there are many questions that the audience might have for any of our 3 writers. I think somebody will have a microphone to pass to anybody in the audience who would like to ask questions. If not, I will continue to ask questions. But do you want to have my... Yes. Hello.
Hi. Oh, I have a question for Victoria. I've read a lot of your books, and it seems like the form is very different in each one. You talked about repetition, and I think in Barbie Chang there's a lot of repetition and words that sound similar, kind of transitioning, the multiple meanings. And then Obit is very visually a very tight form, and with this new book, it's very syllabic. I was just wondering how your experience differed from writing each of these collections, and what each form kind of allowed you to explore, learn.
Yeah. So the question is, I've written in so many different ways. And if the experience of writing in different forms or using different constraints or, different sound is important in Barbie Chang and, The Boss. And, I get bored super easily. Thank you so much for reading all my work, by the way. And I get bored super easy. So I think for me, it's just my personality. I feel so much of writers. It's just it's like who we are. And the older I get, the more I find that to be really lovely and beautiful, is that you just do you, and the way that you feel is a representation of what makes you happy. And so for me, since we're talking about joy and happiness, what makes me happy is to constantly be in motion. So both physically, mentally, and writing wise. And I like to move. And so I think for me, that trying different things and writing as play for me versus something super serious or a career or about fame or publishing, like I just enjoy it. And so for me to enjoy writing, that's kind of what I do to keep my own self challenged and interested.
I guess this is a question open to any of you. I myself am a musician, and it's just so obvious that a beautiful piece of music can be one of the saddest pieces of music, or that, in music, the way emotions are portrayed has nothing to do about whether the sound of the piece is beautiful or, it's very easy to be subtle. And to me, it seems like writing is much more solid and fixed. So I'm curious how you all seem to be interested in other artists, other writers, which is fabulous. How does that notion of language, being able to play with emotions, work in your work?
I think for me, because I trained as a painter and I was making abstract paintings for a long time, I thought a lot about how to create this level of abstraction in the language. And for me, that was how I wanted to create this spaciousness, so that instead of describing in detail, like there's like very little interiority in this book. And I think for me, creating that level of abstraction was how I hoped readers could project their own experiences and emotions. So that's my answer.
I think that's really interesting what you said. I think of language as being very precise in the order that we put it together, but for me, it's about openness and about possibility. So both in terms of meaning, but also in terms of the combination of language in interesting ways as a poet or sonically. But I feel like language is no more fixed than any other art form. I think it's equally open, but I think there's a precision that seems like, you're putting specific words next to each other, but I constantly marvel, and especially when you're working in syllabics, but we could be given the exact same assignment, every single person in here. Oh my gosh, I can guarantee you that there's not a single person that will write the same thing. One line, I give you the same number of words, the same subject matter. That's extraordinary to me. And so to me, I think language is very unfixed. And it's also, I think, describing very unfixed human emotions, which are very capacious and constantly in motion.
Yeah, I don't know about, there are things I've written when I've been feeling emotional, but I don't think they're very good. And there are things in here actually that events that I might have written over the years, and I've rewritten because there are certain things that I suppose occur, and it's hard to know how. Yeah, sometimes it is hard to know how exactly you're supposed to render it. And there is a scene later on in the book where the narrator is in Yorkshire, and she comes across a young man who is hanging from a tree, and she's quite young at the time when this happens. And that is actually something that I experienced many years ago, and I have written about it. And then looking back at the writing, I thought, well, that's really bad the way you've written about that. It's just too overwrought. It's kind of annoying. What's the best way to do this? It's really hard to know, actually. And I think it was, I don't know, was it Wordsworth who said about recollection in wise passiveness or something? There is a sense, I think, that maybe time needs to pass. And it's maybe not necessarily about my own emotional response. And there are so many things then about that situation as I got older. So many more strands to it, I think, and so many emotions that are not necessarily the immediate ones that I wanted to. There's a lot of anger in this book. I realize that there's a lot of, but it's not there in the sense of just vitriol, you know. I'm not ranting. I don't want to rant. But I was just feeling really just so angry about quite a lot of different things. And a lot of them were to do with class and about classism in the UK. Because I'd realized, and it taken me quite a long time to realize that really people have asked me over the years, oh, why did you move to Ireland? And I just say, oh, I was young, I don't know. Just did kind of thing. But actually, I realized I went there because if I'd stayed in England, my life would have been really boring. Really boring. The options available to me as a working class female. It would have been nice enough, you know, it would have been a nice enough life, but it wasn't really the one that I wanted for myself. So, I don't know whether that really explains anything.
Hi, thank you everyone for the talk. I think I was quite inspired. I have a question for Victoria and Pik-Shuen, which is, how was the experience of writing about grief? How did it, if it transformed your experience with grief? Just curious to know about your guys' experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think I resisted writing about grief for a long time. Kind of what you were saying is just letting things sit. And something you said also struck me about, you know, when you have like really deep emotions that you didn't feel like your writing was very good. I actually feel like when I have very deep emotions, like in my regular life, that it doesn't come out, but that's when it comes out in my writing. And so I have that opposite experience with writing, and it's a way for me to work through the trouble in my life, which is we always have trouble in our lives. And then I also was trying to see if I could describe grief, all these really, really awful emotions that I had been feeling for a while. And is it possible through language to describe something like that? And obviously, I think it's not really, because otherwise I would have written like one poem versus like 100 poems. And so I think I kept on trying to get at something that's kind of undefinable. But for me, it made me feel better. And it's, because again, I think of my writing as course, like I was talking to somebody, and in my hybrid book of some things, essays, whatever, I don't know what to call them, Dear Memory, they're literally letters to like my mother and other people. And so I felt like I was talking to somebody. And maybe in Obit, it was to an imaginary listener, like if I was sitting across from someone saying, let me see if I can describe to you in language how I feel. And there's something very therapeutic. People say, oh, you shouldn't write for therapy. Or I only write for therapy, my self-therapy. And so I felt so much better after I write, period. If I don't write, I feel very unhappy and miserable and itchy and annoyed. So.
I think because I wasn't a writer before, that because I started writing out of being in a state of grief, that the two things became completely intertwined for me. And in the beginning, it was just feeling like, for me, grief felt kind of like this liminal space where it's like kind of dreamlike. And that was what it felt like to write at the time. Like I would just sit down and write from the first sentence to the last, and some of those parts are still barely changed since then. But then over time, because I decided to turn it into a book, I thought more about the exact order of the words and how it would read and be understood by readers. But I think, yeah, it wasn't like a conscious decision to, let me write about this. It just happened. It was like a need.
We've reached the hour. I have more questions to say. I was wanted to the idea of returning to material and telling, approaching material in different ways. And I was thinking, Claire-Louise, about the Russian man in the grocery store who kind of shows up a few different times in the book, and the tellings and the retellings that sort of build the worlds of these three remarkable books. So please do stalk our writers on their way to the park, where they will be signing copies of the book. By Sausalito Books by the Bay, I believe, is the tent in the park where they'll be signing. And thank you all very much for coming to this wonderful tour.